Well, good evening. My name is Eric Casper. I am the director of the Menard Center for Constitutional Studies, and I'd like to welcome you here for this evening's program, which is Yascha Mounk speaking on democracy, diversity, and discourse. Now, the Menard Center for Constitutional Studies was established in 2016, and the mission of our nonpartisan center is to promote research, education, and community outreach on matters related to the U.S. Constitution and the Wisconsin Constitution. We are able to bring you the programming like what we have here this evening due to a generous gift from the Menard family. And the Menard Center also supports student scholarships, student faculty collaborative research projects, reading groups, symposiums, student workshops, and a host of other events. And if you are interested in learning more about us, we have a webpage on the university's website where you can see some of the things that we're doing as well as to get in contact with us. And if you're here this evening and if you registered for a ticket online, we probably have your email address and you'll be getting more information about us in the coming days and weeks and months. But our co-sponsors for this evening are the UW-Eau Claire Pre-Law Club as well as the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership. And to tell you more about the Thompson Center, I'd like to introduce Dr. Alexander Talk, who is the director of the Thompson Center and an associate professor of political science at UW-Madison.
Great. Thank you, Eric, and good evening. The Thompson Center has been delighted to be able to sponsor tonight's event. We have a long history of collaborating with the Menard Center. We were founded in 2017, just after the Menard Center, and I'm so glad to be doing so again tonight. Thank you for all of you for being here, and for Dr. Mounk for being here, and to our moderators. And everybody here at Eau Claire and the Menard Center who has made this possible. Let me briefly explain what the Thompson Center is, and I'll try not to hold up the night too much. The Thompson Center was established to follow in the footsteps of Governor Tommy Thompson, who proudly worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. In seeking to carry on Governor Thompson's legacy, the Thompson Center works to foster effective public policy by offering public events, funding research and scholarships, and conducting other activities across the UW system. Tonight's event is a great example of the sort of dialogue we try to offer. So if you're interested in more, I encourage you to check out our offerings on our website. We live stream and record almost all of our events, so you can catch even the ones at other campuses. For students here tonight, I also want to plug our Bridging the Divide program, which brings together students with different political perspectives for regular small group conversations about current political issues and free food. With all of that said, I will turn it over to Adam. So we can get on with the show. So thank you all.
I am not the show, so we will move past me quickly. Thank you all for coming this evening on this beautiful Wisconsin spring evening. No? I will not be introducing our two interlocutors, just given the time constraints, but Amna, Khalid, and Jeff Snyder are two professors from Carleton College who are here tonight to serve as provocateurs of Yascha Mounk. So we hope that, we trust that both will do that very, very well this evening. If someone had told me in 2016 when I was working on my dissertation and had leaned over and said to me, hey, have you heard of Yascha Mounk? And then had said 10 years later you'd be sitting in a room with him, I would say, well, A, where? And how did I end up in Wisconsin? And B, have we answered the problems of liberalism by that time? Unfortunately, I think the answer to that is no. Yascha Mounk, who is our guest this evening, needs no introduction. He is a writer, a political theorist whose work examines the challenges facing liberal democracy and pluralistic societies. He was born in Germany to Polish parents. He earned a bachelor's in history from Trinity College at Cambridge and a PhD in government at Harvard University. He's currently a professor of the practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University, with appointments in the School of Advanced International Studies and the Agora Institute. He's also the author of several influential books, including The People versus Democracy, The Great Experiment, and The Identity Trap, which all explore political polarization, identity politics, and the future of liberal democracy. He's also the founder of the online journal Persuasion, a contributing editor at The Atlantic, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and a host of the podcast The Good Fight. His commentary regularly appears in major international publications, and he's widely recognized as a prominent public intellectual defending liberal democratic values and civic engagement. Please join me in welcoming Yascha Mounk and our two interlocutors to the stage. Thank you. Now, because I am the introducer, I get the benefit of asking the first question. So I'm going to lob a soft one in our direction just to get the conversation going. But Jeff and Amna, I trust that you will raise the stakes here. So Yascha, a question that persists all the time in the classes that I teach and with the students that I'm among is, how does liberalism hope to support its goals of capturing individual commitment to their own lives, and yet at the same time engage in public justice and public reasoning? Can we still do that in 2026? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I think this is the first time in my life that I'm in Wisconsin, actually. I was welcomed very warmly to the state yesterday by a state trooper who immediately asked me to do a field sobriety test. But I'm assured that I was much more sober than the average driver in Wisconsin. So, and I had a lovely time today driving around the area a little bit and getting to know the landscape and talking to a bunch of people. So it's been a real pleasure so far, and I hope it won't change this evening. It's a great question. I think we need to go back to what our political system is trying to do, what the liberal element in it is, and how that's sometimes misunderstood, which is a lot of things. So let me try and do it. I think the way to think about a political system is that there's really two values that it tries to incarnate. Political scientists tend to call that a liberal democracy. People who are more conservative in the United States sometimes call it a democratic republic. But the basic idea these terms get is which is that on the one hand, we want to have a democratic system that translates popular views into public policies, right? That part of the core of democracy is that the policies are somehow responsive to what ordinary people want. There's some mechanism for ensuring that our views actually matter. But the other element is that there's an area in our life in which we want to be protected from the government, right? An area of our lives where we say, even if the majority is going to tell us that we have to worship in a particular way, that we should have a particular kind of partner to marry, that we should say or not say certain kinds of things, the majority of our fellow citizens doesn't get to tell us that. There's certain things where we have rights, but we can protect even against the majority of our fellow citizens. And that's the liberal element. That is the piece that political scientists mean by liberal democracy, or that more conservative-minded people might mean by democratic republic, right? Now, how should we think about that realm? Right, like, what are these rights? What is the realm in which the state doesn't get to tell people how to live? And is that conformable with a real valuing of the public good, for ways in which we care about family, in which we might care about our religious communities, and so on? And I think a lot of the critique at the moment of liberalism as a political philosophy, I don't mean left and right, liberal and conservative, I mean as a political philosophy, is the claim that it can't do that it somehow exalts the individual over the community, that it isn't able to speak to virtue and other kinds of values. And I think that's a misunderstanding of a tradition, but that comes from the fact that sometimes people who speak in the name of liberalism have themselves misunderstood the tradition and have acted in ways that I think are misguided. But at its heart, where do these ideas come from? They don't come from a time when people didn't care about religion, or they didn't care about community, or they didn't care about their families. They came from a time in early modern Europe where people were killing each other for hundreds of years because I'm a Catholic and you're Protestant, or I'm this kind of Protestant, you're that kind of Protestant. And it was thought that, in order for me to worship the way I want, I need to prevail in this struggle for power, right? And liberalism was the accommodation that says, you know what? We can live with each other as fellow citizens, even if you worship a different way than I do, even if we don't make this the question of the state. And so the reason why we care about the freedom to worship, the freedom of conscience, the freedom of assembly, is not that liberals somehow think the individual is more important than the community. It's that we think the state doesn't get to tell each of us what's most important to us. And to some of us, we might prefer a life that's very individualistic, that's going off to the big city and not really having any ties to our families or breaking off. All of that is allowed. But for a lot of people, it's going to mean precisely staying rooted in their communities, giving importance to all of those values. But it's they who are choosing this, right? If you are close to your family, if you are close in a religious community, it's not because the state told you to. It's because as a citizen with rights, you are investing importance in those things. And so that's how I would try to answer that challenge in a classroom.
Well, hello. Let me start by saying, Yascha, it's a real honor to serve as your interlocutors. Jeff and I have been following your work for a long time now. And I'd like to start out by asking you to tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to study what you came to study, in great part because a lot of the conversations that we have seen about American politics tend to focus on American politics in a silo. And you bring to it a global perspective, which I think is very valuable at all times, but especially right now. So if you could just tell us a little bit about why you do what you do.
Yeah, of course. So, I would like to say that I sort of found politics and chose to study politics, but I think in some ways politics has always found my family. And so thinking about politics wasn't a choice in a way. I grew up in Germany. My parents grew up in Poland. My grandparents grew up in Western Ukraine. They're Jewish. And so for many generations, my family had the habit of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. My great-grandparents perished in the Holocaust. My grandparents lost a lot of their families and were, alongside my parents, kicked out of Poland in 1968 when the socialist government that my grandparents, as convinced communists, had helped build up, turned on them and threw them out. And so I think, if you grow up in Wisconsin, one of the privileges of growing up in this part of the world can be, not for everybody, but can be the feeling that history and politics is a little bit abstract, right? But it happens in some ways to other people in other places. And I think growing up, the idea that my life was deeply shaped by these historical events was always very concrete to me. So that's one way in which I sort of became interested in politics from a young age. The other thing I guess I'd say, which is relevant to some of my work, is that being an immigrant to Germany and being Jewish, in a country marked by the aftermath of the Holocaust, really set me apart. And I found that I experienced, had some experience of discrimination growing up. I also had some uncomfortable experiences where people were really trying to prove to me how sorry they were for Germany's past and to sort of demonstrate to me that there were good Germans. And I often found that more off-putting than the ones who might be a little bit rude or something like that. And so I think this question of how do you build a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society came to me very early through that lens.
Great. I mean, this is the question that animates your work that we're going to talk about today, is how do you build diverse democracies? And how do you sustain them? How do we get people to thrive in these democracies? So I think we'll start by perhaps defining some of these terms, because, they get used a lot, people attach meaning to them, and you use them in very particular ways. So I'll give it over to Jeff to ask the terms.
Before we get to those terms, let me ask you something, Yascha. Thinking about politics and your family background, one of the themes of your work is that it's impossible to understand politics without understanding how groupish human beings are. And I wonder if you could expand on that. Is that hardwired into our DNA? And why does it matter for the realm of politics that we tend to be groupish?
Yeah, it's interesting. I just had a podcast guest, and this really was one of the bones of contention in our conversation. I think that there is a view which is quite tempting, but which I think ultimately is wrong, which is that children are born and they're just innocent and love everybody, and then there's a corrupt society that teaches them that this person is bad or that person is good, and that's why things like racism and so on exist. And I think that's a little bit overly simple. I think that when you look at the breadth of human history, it becomes quite clear that human beings, for whatever reasons, you can have debates about whether that's for evolutionary reasons or sociological reasons or whatever, it's kind of besides the point, just have a deep tendency to divide the world into an in-group and an out-group. And often some of the most amazing things that we accomplish as humans is the things we're willing to do for the in-group. Defend our neighbors and friends with courage, cooperate on an incredibly big scale, risk our lives to pull a neighbor out of a burning building, volunteer for the defense of our country if it's under attack, protest for a noble cause, as people were doing in Iran in January before the regime brutally beat them down, right? All of that comes in a way from that attachment to an in-group. But of course, that same instinct can also easily be turned against people. It can easily inspire, sometimes in the same act. That person over there, he's my enemy. He's part of the out-group. I don't really need to care about him. And when you look at some of the most violent episodes of human history, at civil wars and periods of ethnic cleansing and genocide and so on, it often came from that same mechanism. And so for me, one way of thinking about politics is that it really is the sort of attempt to manage that human instinct, right? How can we build in the best way on our ability to care about the in-group? The modern nation state is one way of doing that. Across America, we have 300-something million people of extremely diverse origins, extremely diverse religious convictions, ethnic groups, living in extremely different circumstances. And yet, at our best, we're able to have solidarity with each other. We're able to cooperate with each other in a very effective way. And I think that's a great achievement of a modern world. But also to keep in check the tendency that might have to then say, well, we don't need to care at all about people in other countries. So perhaps there's no real way of cooperating in positive sum terms with people in other countries. So perhaps we're justified in bullying our neighbor because they are not part of the in-group, right? And so I think politics, and particularly liberal democracies, the values I've talked about, are an attempt to harness the positive elements of its human psychology while keeping in check the dangers that come along with it.
Yeah, so one of the terms I'm thinking about is the title of your book from a few years back called The Great Experiment. So you've got a multicultural, multi-ethnic, highly pluralistic democracy on the one hand, and you've got our groupishness on the other. How do those things converge to create what you call the Great Experiment? What is the Great Experiment?
Yeah, so the Great Experiment is, first of all, the attempt to build a society that is diverse in those ways, but actually treats everybody as equals. And to simplify a little bit, that society has never really existed for one of two reasons. Either you had societies that were reasonably egalitarian, like Sweden or Denmark, but they weren't very diverse. Or you had societies like the United States historically that were diverse from the beginning. I mean, from close to the founding of the United States, you had, well, certainly you had Native Americans from the founding of the United States, and then relatively briefly thereafter, you had African Americans. But of course, they were not equal. They're not treated as equals. And so I think what we're trying to do today is to build this society in which we are diverse, not like we're trying to be diverse, we just are today in the United States. And we're trying to ensure that we treat each other as equals, that we don't make somebody a second-class citizen just on the basis of their skin color or the religious creed or anything like that. And there's no real historical precedent for that. And so that's what I'm calling the great experiment.
So let me push you a little bit, right? You just said there is no
Provoke me, apparently.
provoke you a little bit. You say there is no historical precedent for it, and that is indeed correct. In fact, a lot of your book you spend discussing why these supposed diverse democracies have failed. I want to ask you, isn't this something, and this would be a critique of liberalism, that in theory this sounds like a good idea, but in practice we have never been able to do it, and chances are we won't be able to do it, in part because of our groupishness, and in part because the state itself gets co-opted. So why strive for a diverse democracy when we actually have no precedent for it or no historical, example to draw on?
Yeah. Well, so 2 points here, right? The first of it, I think the dangers are real, and that's part of what I talk about in the book. Particularly as a philosophical liberal, what I want is a society in which we have rights and duties as individuals. The state treats us on the basis of how we act as individuals. And then, of course, we can imbue groups with a certain amount of standing and meaning in society by our own free choices. But what we don't want is a society like in Lebanon, for example, in which everything is mediated through your belonging in a group, right? You don't go to a Lebanese school, you go to a Shia or Sunni or Maronite Christian school. When you marry, you don't marry under Lebanese law, you marry under the law of your community. And if you want to marry somebody from one of the other groups, you have to fly to Cyprus and do it there, because your state won't allow you to do that in your own country, right? So that is a society in which the constitutive groups have for so long been so hostile to each other. And the only way to keep the peace in any way, which has only succeeded intermittently, is to delegate all these important decisions to the level of a group in a way that ends up, I think, being deeply inimical, both to the good functioning of that society. It's one of the reasons why Lebanon is much more poor than it needs to be, but also to the liberty of individuals, right? You're literally not free in your own country to marry somebody from another group. I mean, what kind of an extreme limitation of freedom is that? So I agree with you that there are these real dangers that we have to take very seriously. But part of the problem is that in our political discourse, we haven't thought about those seriously enough. Now, I think I have a convincing answer to your challenge, though, even if it's sidestepping the question a little bit, which is that we don't have a choice. The United States today is extremely diverse. European democracies today are extremely diverse. If we're having this conversation in Japan, and some Japanese politician would be telling me, I don't know, this all looks pretty complicated, perhaps we should all stay Japanese and not allow any immigration. That's up to them. I don't have anything, I'm not a partisan actor in Japanese politics, right? I mean, immigration comes with advantages, comes with disadvantages. If the Japanese democratically decide that they don't want to open the country to a lot of immigration, I think they have a democratic right to make that choice. In the United States, that is kind of moot. We are an extremely diverse country. The cost of this experiment not succeeding would be calamitous. We know that from history. So we have no choice but to make this experiment succeed.
So, yeah, we're in the experiment, whether we want to be or not. One possible way or one strategy of uniting a wildly diverse heterogeneous population is to encourage a kind of patriotism, creating this superordinate identity that we're all Americans. I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on that. Is that a strategy that we want to pursue? And if it is, how do we address the fact that Donald Trump probably has a very different idea of what counts as patriotic from Jeff Snyder or Amna Khalid or Yascha Mounk? So what about patriotism? Is that a possible solution, to create a sense of common purpose and identity?
So first, I don't want to talk too much about Donald Trump tonight, but I think some people would argue that Donald Trump's conception of patriotism is racist or something like that he thinks that only white Americans can be patriotic. I disagree with that, actually. I think Donald Trump's conception of patriotism is whoever loves Donald Trump. If you love Donald Trump, you're a patriot. And if you don't, then perhaps you're less of a patriot. So that's a sui generis conception of patriotism. I don't think that many people share that precise understanding of it. But so this goes to the heart of this project that I was talking about earlier, right? Like, how can we build on our ability to have solidarity with each other because we think of each other as part of the same in-group, without all of the negative effects that might come from that if you're part of the out-group. So first of all, I am a defender of patriotism. I think patriotism is a very important thing because it's historically what has allowed us to widen our circle of sympathies, right? It's the thing that allows us to say, I don't just care about my family. I just don't care. I don't just care about my social network. I just care about the people who have the same race as me. I care about this much bigger, broader set of people that I may not have met personally, right, with whom I may share a sort of somewhat abstract identity, but I'm actually able to recognize that they have fair claims on me, and I have some fair claims on them, and we together are going to build a society, build a country, right? I think that's a really positive thing. The other thing I worry about is that if the sort of most well-intentioned people in politics say, oh, patriotism, it can go wrong, and it's a little bit icky, perhaps I should stay away from it. Well, it's going to be the very worst people who really take on the symbols of a nation and say, if you're a proud American, then you have to do what we want. And I think that's not a very healthy political decision. So I absolutely think that whether you're conservative or progressive, whether you're on the left or the right, you should claim patriotism and you should contest what patriotism should mean. The second thing I'll say is that there's then obviously a question about what should that patriotism consist in, right? Like, what is the substance of what should make somebody a patriot, right? And historically, that absolutely have been in many countries, including in periods of American history, a sort of ethnically exclusionary vision of patriotism, right? What's a good German? A German is somebody whose parents were German and grandparents were German and great-grandparents were German. If you come from a different part of the world, if you have a different ethnicity, then you can never be German, right? And that is not a very healthy form of patriotism, particularly in a place that is now very diverse, right? So that one I would reject. There's a second one which most people would then give, most political theorists would then give, which is a civic patriotism, right? Like, what defines an American is not that you're white. So for parts of American history, that's how people would have defined it. With the horrible consequence of slavery and Jim Crow and so on, right? Instead, it should be a civic patriotism, right? What makes you an American is your love of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the civic spirit. And I mean, that speaks deeply to me. I'm an American citizen. I became a citizen in 2017, and swearing my allegiance to the Constitution was something that was very meaningful to me, because I'm a great admirer of the Constitution. But like, I'm weird, like, we are all sitting here on a Monday night talking about politics. Like, that's not most people. Like, most people think, like, I'm a proud American. Sure, the Constitution, all that stuff plays into it somehow. That's not the first thing. Most people just aren't as interested in politics as, like, by definition, all of us here tonight in the room, right? And then there's another kind of philosophical problem with that civic patriotism, which is that the constitutions of Austria and Australia are, like, not that different. But if Austria adopted the Australian constitution tomorrow, Austrians wouldn't somehow become Australian patriots, So clearly it's not just about these documents, right? And so I think there's a third element or a second element. There is a civic element that is important, but there's also a cultural element. Part of what it is that we're all Americans is that we partake in some way in this culture. And part of it, culture is historic. Part of it has to do with the Mayflower and the historic costumes and with this and with that. But a lot of it is living and changing, right? A lot of it is the sights and sounds and smells of a place, the dishes of a place, the celebrities and the TikTok stars and the whatever. It's the living, breathing culture of a place that was shaped by a particular group, but also shaped by lots of other groups. And that reflects today the influence of all of those different parts of a population. And so I think that a healthy patriotism has the civic base, but also celebrates the specific culture of the United States, which is different from Austria and different from Australia. And that's why if Austria adopts the American Constitution tomorrow, you're not all going to be Austrian patriots.
So, provocation again, right? I like that idea. I like that we could all be, it has that ring to it, your conception of patriotism or healthy patriotism, that I often find discourses on college campuses have when they talk about community, right? This very positive ring. But let me just challenge you a little bit. Two things I want to ask you. One, community, and we've talked about this before, thinking about India and Pakistan, I come from Pakistan, can be mobilized in very, very, very aggressive, brutal, detrimental ways. So we have to remember that fundamentalist organizations, for instance, are also a community. ISIS is also a community.
I love, by the way, that American politicians often use this word community in all kinds of contexts. I'm pretty sure I once heard an American president in some press conference saying, the terrorist community. It's like a very strange...
But it is, right? I mean, okay, that particular formulation is funny. But community can be mobilized for all kinds of ends. So there's that one question. But my second question is, when you talk about patriotism, cultural patriotism, you talk about everyone partaking in American culture. Well, you know what? In Texas, a lot of people think that brandishing guns is American culture, whereas a lot of people in Minnesota might not agree with that. And in great part, when we think about national culture and national identity, it has to be, it's by design, wide enough to bring many different people into it, because that's how you forge a nation. So when you talk about cultural patriotism, again, it sounds good, but we're talking about an incredibly diverse society where much of what we celebrate as American culture is actually in contradiction with each other. So how do we, this is the fundamental question that diverse democracies are going to face.
Yeah, so on the first point of sort of communities, I think that's precisely why we need a patriotism, right? Like, I think what you're describing is societies in which the allegiance to your subnational community supersedes and trumps the allegiance to a national community. And that's precisely where you got those problems, right? Where, like, what matters a lot of the time, unfortunately, today in India is not that two people are Indian citizens. It's that, one person is Hindu and the other is Muslim, or that one person is from this caste and the other person is from the other caste.
Pause. That's correct. But I'm not just talking about India. I'm talking about patriotism when it comes to India, Pakistan, right? That's where patriotism is being mobilized, and it is patriotic to hate the other and to inflict violence on the other. So that's the piece that I'm trying to push you on.
Yeah, no, and so that's right. And so you need to mobilize the patriotism within India to make sure that these different communities don't, they call it a communal riot in India, which has a kind of quaint ring to it, but is not very quaint in practice. But another strange word of use of the word community, isn't it? Communal.
I'd argue it's the correct use of the word.
Well, perhaps it is,
It captures the dark side.
But I acknowledge that patriotism is always a two-sided coin, right? That there's always a danger that the positive elements of it are going to bleed into the negative elements. And so, in fact, this is a little bit of inside baseball, but in political theory, a lot of people want to distinguish between patriotism and nationalism. And they're saying patriotism is good and nationalism is bad. Because patriotism is all of a kind of like nice community in the good sense, warm feeling, etc. And nationalism is the evil, let's invade another country, jingoistic type. And I somewhat refuse to make that distinction precisely because I think that we're talking about the same phenomenon. So I think of patriotism or nationalism as a half-domesticated beast. And the best we can do is to try and tame it as best we can. But there's always a danger that if we don't tend to it carefully, it might run wild. And I just don't think there's any way around it. But that's absolutely one of the dangers that's inherent to it. I've now forgotten your second question.
My second question was, you talk about cultural patriotism as, I like your formulation of it, but it seems idealistic to me. And part of it is that the creation of a nation requires an elastic definition of what can be included in the nation. So the culture will necessarily have things that are polar opposites. And you want that because you want to forge a nation where you can bring diverse people together. But there is that tension then. When you say cultural patriotism, am I to brandish a gun or am I to wave a peace flag?
Yeah, and I had a lovely lunch today in a diner in Augusta, Wisconsin, and people were wonderfully welcoming, and I learned a lot about their town. It was lovely. They did say, you live in New York? Why would you want to live in New York, right? So there was a sense they had that, like, New York is not really the same culture as we have, right? Like, it's in America, but that's a totally different place, right? And so I see what you're saying, that there can be this sense of kind of difference. But I'll ask you, we're both fellow immigrants to this country. Don't you think that in the end, you compare somebody from Wisconsin and somebody from Texas, and there's big differences between them, but you put next to them somebody from France or somebody from Pakistan, and it turns out they have a lot in common?
Actually, I'm not sure. I don't think I would fall in the same place as you. I think sometimes those differences are more vast between Americans than they are between people from outside and Americans of a particular area.
Yeah, so perhaps we do disagree about that. I feel like obviously there's big socioeconomic differences in others, and in some ways, somebody who's highly educated in the US is going to have more in common with somebody who's highly educated in Pakistan or in France than they might with somebody who's part of a very different social stratum or something like that. And that exists for sure. But I do think that there's so many shared cultural codes, even across the most diverse parts of the United States. The way people talk to each other, the cultural references, the sort of just natural parts of the invisible social script of, how you talk to a waiter or how you talk to a customer or how, to me, sort of, that is striking. I mean, I can tell you another example. I mean, again, when I was 18 years old and went off to college, I thought that nationalism was this weird ideology of the 20th century that we're going to leave behind in the past. And it doesn't explain the most important thing in politics, and it's not how people should identify, perhaps at some level. And I just think we're naive. I think, whoever bet in the year 2000 on nations are going to be the dominating force of the next 25 years of politics predicted the world a lot better than people who said, there's all of these differences within nations, etc.
Well, let's shift gears just a little bit, but just a quick anecdote on the subject of patriotism. When Amna first came to the United States, it was just a regular day, but she said something like, is today Flag Day or the 4th of July? Because there were so many American flags displayed, which is not the case in Pakistan. And last time I was in Germany was very much not the case in Germany. But shifting gears to thinking about the state of diverse democracies today, Amna and I very much wanted to hear from you about what you see as the main threats facing these diverse democracies today. And we're particularly interested in the global view that you have, because our debates here can sometimes be provincial. So when you zoom out and you look at these diverse democracies, what are the problems? What are the crises? What are the pressure points that are most significant in your assessment today?
Yeah, I would say that there's two quite different crises, but that are logically linked. One crisis is just that there was a period in which the people who are in some ways in charge of our societies, just the elites in the broad sense, the institutions, the mainstream, was able to earn the allegiance of most citizens. I don't think that most people ever look to Washington, D.C. and thought, where's the paragons of moral virtue in the world, or, that they looked at their lives and thought everything is amazing. But I do think that, 30 years ago, perhaps in the United States, most people would have said, in the end, our institutions are working reasonably well. I have this complaint and that complaint, and I don't like this politician, and I don't trust that thing. But in the end, my life is better than the life of my parents was on the whole. And the lives of my kids are going to be better than my life on the whole. And though institutions get a bunch of things wrong, I think they're well-intentioned and actually do their job pretty competently most of the time. And so there was this kind of residual trust in the system. And I think through a series of mistakes, we've squandered a lot of that trust. Part of that is that, from 9/11, which is itself an intelligence failure, and then the response to it, to the Great Recession, to COVID, to a bunch of other things, just a bunch of institutions that were supposed to work didn't work, right? And people feel that. Part of it is an economic story, that there's just a lot less optimism about our future economic prospects than there used to be. Part of that is that a lot of the time, I think the elites have kind of declared a form of cultural secession. We have our own culture, we live in our own zip codes, we have our own media products we consume, and perhaps average people are a little bit uncouth and unwashed, and we shouldn't really trust them. I think that's how a lot of influential people in the country now think. And that's been deeply alienating to a lot of people. So that's one crisis. Now the other crisis, which feels like a different story, but is I think linked, is that a bunch of demagogues and loudmouths, and I tend to call them populists in political science language, are trying to exploit that. And are trying to say, these elites are evil and they're corrupt and they're out to get you and they're collaborating with bad forces around the world. And only I can defend you against them. Only I really speak for the people, and you got to put your full trust in me to fix the situation. And the problem with them is not that they assail the elites, which is a legitimate thing to do in a democracy, and it's not that they're sometimes uncouth or that they don't follow all of the norms of, politeness and political culture or something like that. That's you can like that, you can dislike that. That's fine. The problem is that a lot of them say, only I am a legitimate representative of this country. Only I can legitimately speak for the people. And so by virtue of that fact, everybody who disagrees with me is in some ways an enemy of the people, an enemy of our country, is illegitimate. And that goes against the fundamental pluralism we need in our political system. This has been cited a lot, but I keep going back to this example from 2008, when Barack Obama and John McCain were in a very tense fight for the presidency. Mm-hmm. And they fought. They both fought that their vision for the country was better, and they both desperately wanted to win. And a few days before the election, John McCain, at a town hall event, was asked by somebody, I think that Barack Obama is a bad man and he's dangerous, and if he becomes president, I'm afraid for my country. And McCain said, look, Mr. Obama and me have very different, Senator Obama, I guess he would have said, and me have very different visions of policy, and I think it's important you vote for me, and I'm going to do better for the country. But he's an honorable man. And if he becomes president, you don't have to be afraid for your country, right? That is a deep, deep expression of that democratic pluralistic spirit. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, a bunch of the politicians who are in power around the world, I would say, including in the United States, but also in India and in Hungary and in many other parts of the world, would never do something like that. They fundamentally disagree with that vision of politics. And that's a problem for all of us, I think.
I'm curious just to dive into the current moment a little bit deeper, right? Because there have been wars, there have been public health crises, there have been economic collapses over the past 126 years, just from the 20th century to yesterday. What is it about this moment that makes populism so appealing on a global scale. You mentioned India, you've got Modi, you've got Viktor Orban in Hungary, you had Bolsonaro in Brazil, you could put Trump under the same category. So can you put a finer point on it, or do you have any theories as to why now is this become such a powerful global force?
So I think I've mentioned a bunch of those forces in different contexts of a conversation, but let me pull some of them together and then mention one important one that we haven't really touched on. So I think it is the failure of the elites. It is the fact that the promises they've made for output.
I mean the promises we've made.
Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah. For what political science is called output legitimacy, for actually just having a good output of a political system that satisfies people and the things that are most important to them. I think that's one of the reasons. I think economic stagnation is one of the reasons. You used to have just very rapid economic growth in the past in a way that we haven't had for the last 25 or 30 years, and so people are feeling that. I think the speed of cultural and demographic change is one of the reasons. And then the obvious one to add is social media. So when I teach this material, as I will tomorrow at Hopkins, one of the things I tell students is, if you want to explain the rise of populism, you want to apply a set of different tests. And there's at least three important ones. One is a geographic test, right? Does your explanation work just in the United States or just in Western Europe? Or does it work in all of these different countries that have seen the rise of populists? The second test is a temporal test, right? There's very basic point of social science methodology. You can't have a change from a continuity, right? To explain the rise of these populists, there has to have been some kind of rise in circumstances in roughly the same time frame. So does the timeline kind of match up, right? And then the third is a kind of phenomenological test, by which I just mean, is the thing that you're positing as an explanation, does that match with what people actually care about, what's actually going on in our politics? Is there a kind of match between those different things? And a bunch of the main explanations I've just given have limitations in those, right? So the economic explanation works really well in France, pretty well in Germany, somewhat well in the United States, doesn't work very well in Poland at all. Poland is 30 times richer than it was in 1990. And yet you see this very strong presence of populists there. So that doesn't really work, right? Immigration, big issue in Western Europe. I think one of the reasons for rise of populism there for sure, but doesn't really work in Chile, right? So each of them have challenges. I think the one that works nearly everywhere is social media. That's something that's clearly both made it easier for new political movements and politicians to enter the political scene. It's much easier to organize through social media. And I think it is just prioritized a much more ruthless, egotistical form of politics where you're always putting yourself in the center, you're managing to polarize people around you. I think there's a bunch of dynamics in social media that really are global. So that explanation works in India, and it works in Germany, and it works in the United States. And it roughly more or less fits the timeline of when populists have really started to rise. And it fits phenomenologically in the sense that obviously all of these people, not all, I think pretty much all of them, like it's on social media that they really broke through and they have a really good social media game and so on. So I think social media is really one of the very important explanations as well.
I'm thinking about the medium is the message. And one of the features of social media, for anybody who's ever been on it, is that it's a very affective, with an A, very emotional space that appeals to our emotions and gets our blood pressure going. But as you were talking, Yascha, I'm thinking about political polarization. Polarization and populism, and you want to mix in social media as well. Are populism and polarization always going hand in hand? Is that distinctively in the US, or how do we compare in that regard to other places you've studied?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I don't actually know of a study, somebody must have done one that really examines that empirically. It would be an easy thing to do. I mean, nowadays you can probably fire up a AI agent and have it do it for you. But I think there is a logical link, right? I mean, part of the definition of populism, as I think of it, is precisely this idea that I and only I am legitimate. And that is an immediate link to polarization, right? Because the moment you say anybody who disagrees with me is illegitimate, well, you're forcing society to regroup into, do you like this person or do you dislike this person? You know, there's different degrees of polarization in societies I can think of at the moment, depending on the success that populists have so far achieved. So Germany is still a little less polarized than the United States, in part because the populists there are rising and now play an important role in society, but they don't have a majority. They haven't been in government, etc. Right? But it's very hard for me to think of a place where populists won power and the society is not extremely polarized.
Yascha, when you wrote this book, it came out in 2022, and you know, as I read it today, you were very optimistic about the prospect of diverse democracies, but this was prior to the most recent election, and certainly prior to what we're seeing happening in the Middle East right now. So my question to you is, are you as optimistic as you were when you wrote this? And if so, like, what are you eating? I want to eat the same thing.
Well, I will say, I mean, this book was published in 2022, and so it was, you know, written in 2020 and 2021. And I will say that some of the things that people were saying at the time that were very pessimistic in my reading of it have actually been disproven by the last election. Now, you'll have surmised from some of my comments that I would have preferred a different outcome of the 2024 election. But I think there's actually one very positive thing about it. And that's that there was this assumption that was really strong 5 years ago, we've sort of forgotten it a little bit now, that you know, the way to think about America is as white on the one side and people of color on the other side. And that is also the way to think about electoral politics. There's this whole theory that Democrats have this inevitable demographic majority. But as the share of white voters in the population declines and the share of non-white voters in the population increases, Democrats are going to naturally win all of these states that are, you know, have especially a high number of minority voters. And I think in some of the kind of progressive-leaning political scientists and commentators that I was reading, they were thinking of this as a positive thing, because we'll always have those damn Republicans beat, right? And I always thought that's terrible. I don't want to live in a society where I can walk down the street or where I can look into the audience and know who you're voting for based on the color of your skin. There's countries like that, there's countries around the world that are like that. We can visibly tell which community somebody is in, and with 99% likelihood, that means they're voting for this party or that party. Those are not happy places, right? So the idea that it would be good for America to have those kind of deterministic voting patterns was deeply naive. Now, one of the really striking things about 2024 is that Donald Trump won a significantly smaller share of a white vote than he did in 2020, when he won a significantly smaller share of a white vote than he did in 2016, and a much higher share of a non-white vote. He roughly doubled his share of a black vote from a very low basis, but still. He significantly increased his share of Asian American vote, and he particularly increased his share of a vote among Latinos. And that's how he won. Right? Florida, which was the decisive state in 2000, hanging chads and all of that, which Democrats thought was going to trend towards them because of how many Latinos there are there and so on. I was just in Miami a few weeks ago. I mean, people talk to me in Spanish, assuming that that's my mother tongue, you know, off of that. But that's a Republican place now, right? Yeah. And again, I personally prefer the other side of the aisle, but that is a good thing. It's good that we live in a country where if I know you're white, I don't know who you're voting for. And if I know you're Latino, I don't know who you're voting for. And increasingly, if I know you're black, I don't know who you're voting for. That's actually a really optimistic piece. Now, the bad news is that I think Donald Trump had a real opportunity to build on that, to actually turn the Republicans into a multiracial working class party, which probably wouldn't still be the party I would vote for, but it would be something that actually has a coherent role to play in American politics. I think he's squandering that. He's squandering that for some of the things he's been doing not too far from here in the Twin Cities. He's squandering that with just the aggressive nature of some of the policies that the administration is pursuing, even on areas where we might have a legitimate point, but we're doing it in a way that just seems designed to maximize alienating everybody who's not a hardcore supporter of his. And that's a great shame, and I'm very worried about the current state of the country. But when you ask me about, particularly on the specific questions of this book, is our multi-ethnic democracy working? And are we going to be able to sustain a country in which your ethnic background or your national background doesn't tell you everything about you? Or are we going to collapse into something like Lebanon? I'd say I'm just as optimistic as I was in 2022, yeah.
I really need to be eating what you're eating. Well, on that note, I think we will open it up to questions from the audience.
Yes. Thank you all for the excellent questions to Yascha. The floor is now yours. I want to remind you that this is a question and answer session, so questions should be phrased in the form of a question. We'll take your comments afterwards. So who would like to ask the first question? Grace.
First off, thank you so much for being here tonight. We really appreciate it. I wanted to ask you a question about the future of liberal democracies. Do you think that younger generations are less committed to liberal democracy, or are they just currently dissatisfied with the way that it functions?
Yeah, great question. I think that those two things are related. So certainly I've seen in polling that I've done, or in analyses of data that I've done, that there is a difference between younger people and older people in the degree of a commitment to the political system. So around 2013, 2014, with a colleague, Roberto Foa, we did some work based on the World Values Survey, where we looked at young people's attitudes towards democracy, or people's attitudes in general, I should say. And what we found, for example, that on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is it to you to live in a democracy? Older people in America said 10 out of 10. Over 2/3 of older Americans said that. And younger Americans, less than 1 in 3 people said that. Even when you asked about explicitly authoritarian alternatives to democracy, like would you prefer army rule, young people were much more open to that. So I think the data is quite clear on this. And I think it comes downstream from two facts. A, that older Americans, I think, still were alive at a time when they felt like the system was working. And younger Americans have only seen America in an extremely polarized moment, and in a moment where perhaps they're not getting these concrete benefits, where they're not feeling like my life is going to be so much better than that of my parents. And then, secondly, that perhaps the alternatives to democracy are less clear to them. That certainly, if you're one of the now oldest Americans and you were alive at the time of World War II, you knew what it was to face fascism. If you lived through the Cold War, you knew what it means to face communism and what life was like to a citizen of the Soviet Union. For younger Americans, that all seems very abstract. And so I think we've lost one of the things that inspired our faith in democracy, which was a genuine understanding of how bad the alternatives are. So yeah.
Question back there from Trinity.
Hi. So we've heard about like your ideal world or state, like how people should act. I guess I'm wondering, is there any policy or law, even something to be implemented in like a K through 12 education setting that you would recommend to help maintain this sort of like ideal world?
Yeah, so I think there's a bunch of things we should do, and just as importantly, I think there's a bunch of things we shouldn't do. So what we should do is have more civic education, and I find there's a kind of slightly weird thing where there's not enough civic education. When in some pockets of a country there's civic education, but we don't want to talk about any of the bad parts of American history. And then in other pockets of a country there is civic education, but it's all about how terrible America is and how we go and protest and change things. And I think that we need a middle ground that I think is how actually most Americans feel according to polls, which is A, that civic education is very important, and that everybody who graduates from high school should have a genuine understanding of our constitutional system. B, we should of course acknowledge the dark sides of American history and the shortcomings of our country as part of that education. But C, we also need to actually tell people what is great about our political system and why democracies are worth defending, and the ways in which America has improved over time. as Barack Obama said, and I think Bill Clinton perhaps before him, that there's nothing. You're going to tell me that I'm being too naive. There's nothing that's wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America. That is always an ongoing battle, and it's not guaranteed that we're going to win that battle. But when you look at American history, there are deep injustices in it, and it's also the agency of Americans of all origins and all ethnicities that have improved our country, and that mean that some of us and many of those injustices have been overcome. And so I think we need a civic education that gives people a real appreciation for what democracy is and how bad the alternatives to it are in a way that it doesn't always do today. I also worry, and this is particularly a worry for the most elite institutions, but those matter because they educate a lot of the decision makers of tomorrow, where rather than trying to broaden the in-group, we define the in-group so narrowly that we actually make it more likely to have that kind of communitarianism, that kind of fight between different communities. So I'm thinking, for example, of practices in many elite private schools today, in LA and DC and New York, where teachers will come into a classroom, often when kids are as young as 10 or 8 or 6 years old, and split them up into different affinity groups. And, black students are going to go into one classroom, Latino students are going to go into a second classroom, and white students are going to go into a third classroom. And the idea of this in some way is to sort of make the white students aware of their white privilege and to turn them all into great anti-racist activists. But I think it's deeply naive, because when you take kids at that age and you tell them the most important thing about you is your skin color, they don't learn to fight for justice. They don't learn to fight against genuine prejudices and injustices. They learn that that is what defines them. That is the most important thing about them. And I particularly worry about the white kids in this context, not because I think they're going to be uncomfortable. Being uncomfortable is part of education sometimes. It's just fine. But because I don't think that at scale this is going to lead to them becoming great advocates for a more just society. I think it's going to tell them, if the way our school community works is that each person just advocates for the interests of a racial group, well, then we should advocate for the interests of our racial group. And that's not the kind of politics that I want to inspire and create in this society. So lots of things we can do positively, lots of bad things that have been adopted as practices in the last years that we should avoid as well.
Other questions? Raise your hands high so that Phil can see you. Back there.
So you alluded to how President Trump previously could have kind of adapted the Republican Party to be more accommodating of diversity. And that's kind of antithetical to my current understanding of what the Republican Party is. So I was kind of wondering how you think he could have gone about doing that.
Yeah, well, part of it is that he succeeded in 2024 in terms of how he broadened the electoral tent of the Republican Party, right? So, he clearly succeeded in convincing a lot of African Americans, a lot of Asian Americans, and particularly a lot of Latinos who hadn't previously voted for him or the Republican Party to vote for him. And part of that was that Joe Biden was unpopular and the Biden administration was unpopular and people felt like the economy wasn't going well and he was the other guy who they could choose from. But part of that is what at the time I called a kind of aspirational populism. The Democratic Party sometimes has a tendency to say, we're going to raise your minimum wage. And the Republican Party says, we're going to help you build a small business. And that's a lot more appealing to a lot of Latinos, right? I think a lot of them also can have a more optimistic vision because they perhaps still feel that sense of progress that other Americans haven't experienced. For a lot of Latinos who are American citizens, perhaps their grandparents were, farmers in a very poor community in Mexico or in Guatemala or in El Salvador or something like that. The parents came to the United States and often they worked in quite lowly jobs. Perhaps they were cleaners, perhaps they were construction workers, right? And they themselves have gone to college or to community college or they learned a trade and they're actually rising into the middle class and they're pretty optimistic about things, right? They still have that feeling that my life is better than that of my parents and their life is better than that of their parents. And I think often the Republicans can be better at speaking to that, and that's something that Democrats need to be aware of if they want to compete with that. And then even on immigration, you look at the opinions of Latinos, they're very different from what progressives tend to think Latinos think about immigration. So Latinos don't have a very systematically different view of immigration than white Americans. They're pretty close together. And often, when a Democratic Party politician wants to know what Latinos are thinking, they're going to go and speak to the head of some immigrant advocacy organization who has a degree from, Princeton College, who comes from a completely different social stratum. And that person is going to say that Latinos all believe X and Y progressive positions. And that's actually very far from what the average member of that community believes, right? And so even on immigration, I think Republicans in 2024 were able to make inroads in some of those demographic groups by saying we want clear control of the border with Mexico, and we think the Biden administration has gone wrong on that. Now, what most Americans didn't want, and what Latinos didn't want, is the indiscriminate going after people that we've seen, intimidating people, whether legal residents or not, by having ICE agents that don't identify themselves, that are wearing masks, terrorize particular communities. I mean, that is obviously a way of driving that potential electorate for the Republican Party straight back into the arms of the Democratic Party. And I think that it'll take a long time for Republicans to be able to rebuild the trust that Trump is destroying through these extreme policies.
So I've actually got a question. I'd be curious to hear the panel weigh in on this, especially if there's disagreement, and I kind of really hope that there is. You've been all using your terms fairly carefully and referring, and I'm sorry, I know, Yash, you said you didn't want to talk about President Trump, but I've got a question about President Trump. There's in the commentariat, there's been an argument in the last few months about what to call President Trump or what kind of label to use to refer to President Trump. And I'd be really curious what all of you think the term that we should use when we refer to President Trump is. And I really hope that you all disagree about that.
You're asking about the F word.
The F word. I am asking about the F word, and I'm deliberately not saying it.
Leaning towards it, but not quite it as of now.
I mean, the word that's coming to mind is narcissist. Let's turn to Yascha and see what he has to say.
I'm definitely a narcissist. I think that one is reasonably uncontroversial.
Personalist?
Power is just, I mean, Louis XIV said famously, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state. And I feel like Trump actually has a lot of an absolutist monarch in that sense. Look, there's like 8 characteristics of fascism or something like that, and like some of the standard definitions in the literature. And, he probably, there are some of those characteristics which apply to Trump. To me, one of the key characteristics of totalitarian political systems, whether it's fascism or communism, is that you need to be political. That they do not want to accept that somebody can simply not care about politics. Right? In Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, there was some choice you had about how political you were. But if you didn't join the Hitler Youth, or you didn't join the Communist Youth Organization, that immediately closed a lot of doors to you. And the vast majority of people did join those groups. Under pressure, well, some very willingly, others under pressure. So one key element to me of fascism is this total mobilization of society. And I just don't think we're anywhere close to there in America. Right? I don't think that if you say, if you're a very big name critic of Trump, much bigger name than anybody on the stage, it's scary. And I have some friends who fit that bill, and there's frivolous persecutions of political opponents. that the Department of Justice has tried to do, that our judiciary has so far not gone along with, which is a good piece of news. But that's scary. That's very, very bad. It's not democratic. But I think to get to fascism, you'd have to get to, somebody is asked, do you care about politics? And they say, I don't really care about politics, and that means they're going to lose their job in the federal government. I think it's like a different level of meddling with society that has historically characterized the regimes that I really think of as fascist. And thankfully, I don't think we're quite there.
Just for the sake of disagreement, I'll do it, Sam, I'll do it. Well, what about the fact that the man has authorized the killing of American citizens and is bending the truth to the point that he is saying that he's literally saying that we need to disavow what we're seeing with our eyes happening on the streets of Minneapolis?
I would also add that social mobilization takes time, and you get a couple more years.
Yeah, I mean, again, if there's 8 characteristics of fascism, I think he fulfills some of them. And so that's why I'm not giving 100%. I don't think that's a silly question. I think it's a real question. Let me try another cut at this answer, right? When you look back at the history of fascist regimes, they were quite openly hostile to democracy, right? They were saying parliamentary democracy is corrupt, and we don't, and we're not equals. We need a hierarchy, and I'm at the top of it. And I think that if you made that your electoral pitch in the United States today, people would not go along with it, right? A lot of what makes populists appealing is that they say, it's actually the system before me that wasn't fully democratic, right? It's those cities that weren't really listening to the people. And I promise you to make it more democratic. Now, I don't think we're living up to that, right? I think we're making it less democratic, but they're trading on the aspiration for democracy in a certain kind of way. Another interesting indication of that is that in the 2024 election, there was an exit poll in Pennsylvania, I believe, in which people were asked, do you think that American democracy is in danger? Something like 3/4 of people said yes. That's the one thing all Americans can agree on, that American democracy is in danger. And among the people who thought it was in danger, more people voted for Donald Trump than for Kamala Harris, right? So they think that democracy is in danger from the Democrats, and he's the Democrat who's saving democracy. And I think that's quite different from the fascists, who just openly were opposed to democracy as a political system. And it's important to understand that because it makes it more dangerous. Because if somebody said, I hate democracy, vote for me as president, I think Americans would say, what are you talking about? No. But Trump is able to trade on that discontent to say, I'm the true Democrat, and even though I don't buy that, a lot of people seem to buy that, and that's part of what makes him capable of winning elections. That's part of what makes him dangerous. So that's why I think so. Just saying, oh, he's a fascist, it doesn't actually help us understand the nature of his appeal.
There was a question back in the back from Braden.
Let's go. Okay, hello. My question is about institutions, because I think we've talked a lot about the issues, one of the core fundamentals of liberal democracy is that institutions can help prevent populism, like a tyranny of the majority kind of situation. But I think a lot of people will turn on their TVs and they see institutions being used as a means of populism, as a means to make in-group politics affect regular people or minorities. So what would you say to people that maybe feel like institutions are fundamentally for the in-group? And maybe what would you say to those that are maybe losing faith in institutions?
Well, I guess what I'd say is it's very important to be critical of our shortcomings, and it's very important to recognize where our institutions aren't working well, but you need some kind of comparison group. And where on earth are those things working better? Is there any dictatorship in the world, any non-democratic system in the world where the local minorities are somehow treated better? Is there any place where, without the protection of those institutions, we're better able to treat people with respect and dignity? And you can make comparisons within the democratic world. I would say that Sweden is probably doing better at that than the United States at the moment. Absolutely, great. That's not because Sweden doesn't have liberal democratic institutions. It's because their liberal democratic institutions are currently in a better state. I think these institutions are not perfect, but they are what has allowed us historically to make huge progress. It's the reason why African Americans have much more equality of status today than we did 50 or 100 or 200 years ago. It's why within my lifetime, sexual minorities have gone from being ostracized by society, Ellen DeGeneres losing her sitcom when she openly stated that she had a female partner, to being welcome in communities around the country and having visibility and influence and power in a way that was unthinkable in the 1990s, not that long ago. And I would say that it's the institutions today that are actually, to the extent that they're succeeding, and that's a very open question, reigning in Donald Trump. It's Donald Trump controlling the executive, which means that they went after Jim Comey and Letitia James and all of those people. And it's the slow, boring state institutions of the judiciary who said, hang on a second, this is a frivolous lawsuit. We're going to throw it out. We're not going along with that. So I think, we absolutely must be critical of the ways in which our democracy is in danger at the moment and the injustices that exist in our country. But we have to be very careful not to throw the baby out of the bathwater. And I think it's our institutions that have allowed us to make progress on those points and that ensure that minorities have some protection. And if we didn't have those institutions, things would be looking a hell of a lot worse.
Question over here, Phil. And then I see one we'll tee up next from Michael.
Sort of two questions here. So if we think about Republican voters kind of thinking that they're, protecting democracy from the Democrats, and Democratic voters thinking that they're protecting democracy from the Republicans, there's kind of this like one up, becoming more extreme as we go along. First question is when, and the second question is how do you see this kind of peaking? It's a big question, but speculate on it, I guess.
I mean, in the wisdom of the informal constitution as influenced by George Washington and the formal constitution as ratified by an amendment in 1948, I may be getting the year wrong, presidents are limited to 2 terms. And I do think that Donald Trump is a big part of the reason for why our country is so polarized at the moment. And that inability to show any kind of respect for the political enemy, the political adversaries, I would prefer to think of them, is so central to our politics. Everybody says the most important election of our lifetime is the next one. I think the 2026 midterms are important, and I'd personally be very, very relieved if Democrats manage to at least win back the House of Representatives and there be some balance of power in Washington, D.C. I think the most important election of the next 5 or 10 years is going to be the 2028 Republican primary, right? Because depending on who becomes the figurehead of the Republican Party in 2028 and after 2028, we're either going to see a new figurehead continuing that legacy of Donald Trump or a different figurehead that is able to ratchet down the tone a little bit. Now, I'm not holding my breath. I think the likelihood that a very different kind of Republican gets the nomination in 2028 is not that high. But I think it will make a difference whether it's Marco Rubio or J.D. Vance. And I think it would make a big difference if it was Spencer Cox. And so it is imaginable that at some point you get a real change. Now, what you often see is that when populists outstay their welcome, as they often eventually do, there is a return to quasi-normality for a while, but you also have these long legacies of populism that persist. And so one thing I worry about as a kind of possible trajectory of American politics at the moment is the kind of Keir Starmer scenario. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I could imagine that in 2028, Democrats win the presidential election. You get, hopefully, a reasonable Democrat. They're fine. They don't really have a new vision. They haven't really figured out some of the internal contradictions within the political party. Like Keir Starmer in Britain, who was elected with a big majority, they grow to be quite unpopular very quickly. And then in 2032, it could be Tucker Carlson, or it could be Donald Trump Jr., or it could be any one of a number of pretty scary people. I think those of you who are on my side of a political aisle, we all have a lot of work to do to make sure the Democrats are actually ready for the challenge in 2028, so that doesn't happen.
Michael, you had a question.
Yeah, I want to go back to your point about social media, its role in increasing populism. What feature about it do you think lends it to that role? Is it attention spans decreasing, like these increasing one-term governments that used to be so rare and now common? Is that a problem? Is it easy to get a following, or just negativity so no government can at all survive? Like what part of it makes it so essential to populism?
I mean, you gave a lot of great answers in your question. Bad questions are 5 minutes long and don't have a question mark. Good questions are 30 seconds long, have a question mark, and already give me the answer. So that's excellent. Look, political scientists tend to think about it as supply and demand, right? So in an electoral context, is an explanation supply side or demand side? The supply side here would mean there's more political offerings. And you see that very clearly in countries that have multi-party systems, where the rise of social media has just increased the number of political parties in a political system, because the cost of organizing has just gone down. It's just become much easier for people who are outside a certain mainstream to come in. And part of that is because the structure of communication has completely changed. It used to be that the structure of communication was one to many, which means that you had to have quite a lot of resources, a huge staff, in order to broadcast to the world, right? And that also then meant that elites could keep more control over political discourse, but it also meant that there was this like big cadre of professional journalists who had a common education, a common professional trajectory, a common set of standards about what to print and what not to print. And that really kind of limited the boundaries of a political discourse. And that's totally changed. I mean, I always travel with a carry-on. I never have checked-in luggage, because I travel a lot. In that carry-on, I have a professional-grade microphone that's $300. It's not that expensive. And I hook it up to my laptop that I have on me. That's, $900. And I can produce sound quality that, unless you play it on the most sophisticated Bose sound system in the world, you're not going to know whether it's from a professional NPR studio or, recorded here in the hotel room at Eau Claire with the stuff I have in my carry-on bag, right? And when I hit publish on Megaphone and, reach a significant audience with that, and there's others, like Joe Rogan, who reach tens of millions of people in that way, right? So just the way in which we communicate is totally different. Obviously, in social media, you can have 100 followers. If you make a really good viral joke or you say something really provocative, that little post might be read by 10 million people over the course of the next 24 hours, right? So that totally changes how public discourse works. And so that starts to be a supply-side explanation. Demand-side explanation, where social media shifts how people think about politics, what they want from it, the kind of gladiatorial battle they expect, in which perhaps their views shift because those extreme views that were kept out of a sort of polite discussion suddenly are front and center. And so those are sort of two ways of thinking about it. But I think some of the stuff that you alluded to is absolutely central as well.
Okay, I'm going to exercise a little sovereignty here and let Amna ask the last question, and then we will conclude.
Thank you. Yascha, actually, just piggybacking on what was just asked, it's interesting. So what you're saying is that the democratization of the public sphere has actually led to a lower quality of democratic governance. And that poses a whole set of other interesting questions, which we don't have time for right now, but I just wanted to put it out there. My question to you is, foreshadowing what you're working on now, how will AI change democracy?
How many hours do we have?
We can have you back.
I'd love to. The book should be out next spring. So look, I'll try and keep it brief because I'm really in the middle of writing this book, and so I haven't condensed how to talk about it in an elevator pitch. I think that AI is a very fundamental transformation of a world. I think there's been 5 or 6 big transformations of a world through technology. Agriculture, writing, the printing press, the Industrial Revolution, computing. I think AI is at that level. I think that a lot of what created the modern world is a rising demand for high-skilled labor, which created the middle class, which meant that governments had to ask things of ordinary people, and ordinary people could ask things in return, which created the basic categories of our societies in social terms. I worry very much that AI is going to decrease the demand for high-skilled labor. There's kind of crazy people in Silicon Valley who think that nobody's going to have a job in 2 years. I think that's hugely exaggerated. I think there's also overly cautious economists who say there's nothing new under the sun, this is just like every time before. I think that a general purpose technology that can do mental labor is something new. We haven't had that before. I do think it's going to tap what I'm calling the mental reservoir, the area in which only humans were able to do certain kinds of tasks before. And if that leads to a structural lack of demand for skilled human labor for 50 or 100 years, perhaps eventually new jobs are going to appear. But for 50 or 100 years, as happened during the Industrial Revolution, by the way, that's enough to have very, very worrying economic consequences, political consequences, and cultural consequences. And tracing those out is what I'm going to be doing in this book.
Great. Well, please join me all in thanking Yascha.
Thank you all for coming this evening. Please check us out for more Menard Center events throughout the year. We've got some great programming coming up. Jeffrey Rosen will be on campus on May 4th to talk about a couple of his books, one, most importantly, The Pursuit of Happiness. Take care and have a good evening.